The call came on a Tuesday, just like the last one, and the one before that. My phone lit up at 8:47 in the morning, and before I even looked at the screen, I already knew. My stomach already knew, tightening the way it always does when I see that name. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. "Sweetheart," my mother said, her voice carrying that particular warmth she reserves only for these occasions, the warmth that arrives like a weather system preceding a storm. "We've been struggling a little this month. Your father's back has been acting up, and the insurance didn't cover." I was already moving toward the kitchen, already filling the kettle, already doing the small mechanical things that help me stay calm while my mother explains, in patient and loving detail, why she needs $800 by Friday. This was the 11th month in a row. I counted. What she doesn't say, what she has never once said, is that 9 years ago she stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, folded her hands in front of her, and told me I had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. I was 18 years old. I had $47 in my checking account. And now she calls every month asking for money. But that's not where this story starts. That's not even close to where it starts. A beginning that makes sense would be somewhere around September, the year I turned 17, when the small, odd feeling I'd been carrying around in my chest for years finally started taking on a recognizable shape. Before that, before I understood what I was living inside, there was just our house on Crescent Mill Road, with the overgrown hydrangea bushes my dad kept saying he'd trim and never did, and the smell of my mother's pot roast on Sunday afternoons, and my brother Kyle sprawled on the couch with his shoes on the cushions, which was somehow never a problem when he did it. Our house was the kind of house that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a driveway that needed sealing, a kitchen that always had something simmering on the back burner. From the outside, from the street, we were exactly what we appeared to be. A regular family in a regular neighborhood where nothing particularly interesting ever happened. My name is Sara. I was the younger one by 4 years. Kyle was 21 when I was 17, and he was, by every account my parents offered, the person the whole household orbited around. Not out of cruelty, or at least not in the beginning. I don't want to be unfair about that. He was charismatic in the way that certain people simply are, the kind of person who walks into a room and fills it with something that isn't quite energy but isn't quite peace either, something that commands attention without quite demanding it. My father adored him. My mother would have walked through fire for him, barefoot, and been grateful for the opportunity. I was different. I was the quiet one, the one who read books in her room, who got straight A's without being told to, who set the table without being asked, and took out the recycling on Thursdays because someone had to. I was not unloved. I want to be careful about that because it matters. My parents did love me, in the way that some people love a piece of furniture that completes the room. They were glad I was there, glad I was useful, glad I required so little. What I didn't understand then, what took me years to understand, is that being required so little is its own kind of being required nothing at all. I was 17, and the odd feeling in my chest that September was the first time I'd started to notice the seams. It started with college applications. I was a junior, early in the year, and my guidance counselor, Mrs. Hargrove, had called my parents in to discuss my options because my test scores were exceptional enough that she wanted to make sure the family understood what scholarships I might qualify for, what schools I might reasonably reach for, what the financial picture might look like. I remember she used the word picture. I remember thinking it was an interesting choice. My parents sat in the 2 chairs across from her desk, and I sat in the 3rd chair off to the side, and Mrs. Hargrove explained that with my GPA and my extracurriculars and my test scores, I was competitive for merit scholarships at a number of excellent schools, some of which might be entirely covered, or nearly covered, by aid. My mother nodded pleasantly. My father asked about the timeline. No one wrote anything down. On the drive home, I asked, carefully, because even then I knew to be careful, whether we'd be able to contribute anything toward college if I didn't get a full ride somewhere. My mother glanced at my father. My father kept his eyes on the road. "We've always been a little stretched thin," he said, in the particular tone he used when the conversation was supposed to end. You're smart, Sara. You'll figure something out. My mother said nothing. She had been nodding the entire conversation with Mrs. Hargrove, and now she was looking out the passenger window at the gas station we were passing, as though the gas prices were extremely interesting. Something about that silence, the shape of it, the quality of its texture, settled in my chest like a stone, not heavy enough to break anything yet, just heavy enough to notice. 4 months later, at Christmas, Kyle announced he was thinking about opening a restaurant. He'd been working as a line cook at a place downtown for 2 years and had some ideas. Some real ideas, he said, about what kind of food people in our town actually wanted. My father put down his fork and asked him to explain. Kyle explained for 45 minutes. My father listened with the focused, hungry attention of someone hearing the most important thing said at any table in recent memory. My mother kept refilling Kyle's glass and touching his arm. By the time dessert was served, my father had offered to help with seed money. "We've got some savings put away," he said. "Nothing crazy, but enough to get you started if you're serious about this." I remember the particular way I held my fork. I remember the pattern on the tablecloth, a dark green vine on cream linen, and how I focused on a single leaf near my plate while I processed the fact that 3 months earlier, my father had told me they'd always been a little stretched thin. I said nothing. I ate my pie. I was 17 years old, and I already understood on some cellular level that this was not a conversation I was permitted to have. Senior year came and went. I applied to 11 schools, got into 7, received partial aid from 4. The best offer was a school 3 states away. 60% of tuition covered, which would have left around $14,000 a year in remaining costs. I asked my parents in February if there was any possibility of them contributing to the gap. My father said they were helping Kyle get his business off the ground and things were tight. My mother said she knew I'd find a way to make it work because I was so resourceful. I enrolled in the community college 12 miles from home. It was affordable. I could keep my part-time job at the pharmacy and save. It was a perfectly reasonable plan. I told myself it was a perfectly reasonable plan every morning for the next several months, until I stopped needing to tell myself anymore and simply believed it, which is the particular mercy of being young enough to adapt without understanding what you're adapting to. By the time I turned 18 in March of my gap year between high school and the community college's fall semester, Kyle's restaurant had opened and was struggling. It happens. Restaurants struggle. But what I noticed, in the way that you notice things when you've become a very attentive observer of your own household, was that the struggling restaurant seemed to require regular infusions of money from my parents, and that these infusions were not described as loans, but as investments, and that the word investment was used with the reverent seriousness of something sacred. My parents drove 20 minutes each way to eat at Kyle's restaurant twice a week. They brought friends. They left large tips. My mother framed the menu and hung it in the hallway. Meanwhile, I was working 30 hours a week at the pharmacy and paying for my own textbooks, and had asked once in April whether I could be added to the family's phone plan to save some money, since I was paying $60 a month for a plan of my own. My mother said they'd look into it. Nobody looked into it. In June, Kyle needed his car repaired. My parents paid for it. In July, the restaurant needed a new commercial refrigerator, and my parents paid for a third of it, which they explained to me over dinner as if I had asked, which I had not. In August, I came home from a closing shift at the pharmacy at 11:30 at night and found my parents sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad and several printed bank statements spread between them. They looked up when I came in. My mother said, "Sara, we need to talk to you about something." I sat down. My father took a breath. "We've been thinking," he said, "that it's time you started thinking about getting your own place." I was 18 years and 5 months old. I had $4,200 in savings and a part-time pharmacy job that paid $11.50 an hour. I looked at my parents across the kitchen table with its dark green vine tablecloth, and I felt something shift in my chest that was not quite the same as the stone that had been sitting there since the drive home from Mrs. Hargrove's office. This was different. This was more like the stone cracking in half. "Okay," I said. And because I was 18 and I had been practicing being reasonable my entire life, I said nothing else. They gave me 30 days. Not 30 days, technically. My father said 2 weeks. Then my mother said they weren't trying to rush me. Then, after some back and forth, they settled on the end of the month, which was September 28th, which was 32 days away. I did not ask why. I already knew why in the same bone-deep, unspoken way I had always known the things in that house that were not permitted to be said out loud. Kyle's restaurant was burning through money. The seed investment had grown into something larger and more hungry. I was a cost that could be eliminated. I was, in the final accounting, the kind of furniture that had turned out to be less load-bearing than originally supposed. I called my friend Danny from the pharmacy parking lot on my break the next day, sitting in my car with the windows fogged from the September cold, and I told her what had happened in a voice that surprised me with its steadiness. Danny said, "You can sleep on my couch until you figure something out." I said I'd be there September 29th. I did not cry until I got home that night and lay in my childhood bed looking at the ceiling where I'd stuck glow-in-the-dark stars when I was 9 years old. And even then I cried quietly, with my face in my pillow, which is the crying you do when you've grown up understanding that your grief is an imposition. September 28th, I packed 2 bags and a plastic storage bin. I left my bed, my dresser, most of my books. There wasn't room and I had no car, only a bicycle, and I left my key on the kitchen counter. My mother hugged me at the door. It was the same hug she always gave, warm and brief and complete. My father shook my hand. Kyle's car was in the driveway, freshly washed. The hydrangeas still hadn't been trimmed. I walked to the bus stop with my bags and my bin, and I did not look back. Not because I was dramatic or making a point, but because I had already started figuring out what came next, and looking back would not have helped me with that. What came next was 2 months on Danny's couch, then a room in a shared house with 3 other people, then a promotion at the pharmacy to assistant manager 18 months later, then night classes, then more night classes, then a full-time job at a small medical supply company in their accounts payable department, then a different apartment, this one with just 1 roommate, a quiet woman named Patricia who worked at a dental office and did not leave dishes in the sink. Then my associate's degree. Then my bachelor's, completed over 4 years while working full-time, class 2 nights a week and Saturday mornings, studying on my lunch breaks and on Sunday afternoons at the library where it was quiet and no one needed anything from me. Then a better job, a real job, the kind with benefits and a 401k match and 2 weeks of paid vacation, working in financial operations at a mid-sized healthcare company where I turned out to be very good at seeing where the money went and why. 7 years from the night I left my key on that kitchen counter, I was making $68,000 a year. I had $12,000 in savings. I was renting a 1-bedroom apartment that I loved with a fierceness that surprised me the first time I felt it, and I had spoken to my parents approximately twice in that same span of time. Once when my maternal grandmother died, and once when my father had a minor cardiac event that turned out to be an arrhythmia, treatable, nothing to worry about, the doctor said. Both times the calls were short. Both times I drove the hour and 40 minutes to Crescent Mill Road and sat in the kitchen that still had the same tablecloth and left when there was nothing left to say that could be said. Both times my mother hugged me at the door and my father shook my hand, and Kyle was somewhere in the background, doing something that required his attention, already partly elsewhere. The first call asking for money came on a Thursday in March of that year, 8 months before the story I'm about to tell you really begins. My father called, which was unusual. It was usually my mother who called. And he started with the weather and my job and a general pleasantness that I recognized as the conversational equivalent of WD-40, applied to loosen something stiff before putting pressure on it. Eventually, he said that Kyle's restaurant had finally had to close, which I already knew from Danny, who still lived in town, and that things were a little difficult financially at the moment, and that if I was in a position to help with the power bill, just this month, just the one time, they'd really appreciate it. The power bill was $214. I paid it online before we got off the phone. I don't know exactly why. Something habitual, maybe. Something that had been trained into me so thoroughly it still operated independently of my thinking. I paid it, and I hung up, and I stood in my kitchen for a few minutes looking at nothing in particular, and I had the clear, specific feeling that something had just begun that I did not yet know how to name. I did not have to wait long to find out. The next month, in April, my mother called. Her back had been acting up, she said, and she needed a particular prescription that her insurance only partially covered, and the copay was $90, which was just a little more than she had available right now. I paid it. In May, my father's truck needed a brake job and he didn't have the full amount, $350. In June, my mother mentioned almost in passing that they were a little behind on the water bill. I sent $200. I want to be honest with you about this part. I did not do any of this graciously or with a full and open heart. I did it with the wooden, mechanical generosity of someone doing a thing they've decided they're supposed to do without having actually decided anything, without having examined the decision from any angle, without asking themselves a single question about it. I paid because they asked. I had learned a long time ago that when my parents asked for something, the conversation that followed any answer other than yes was not a conversation I was equipped to have. I was 32 years old, and I had built myself a life, and I was still, apparently, carrying the particular posture of that 17-year-old sitting at the kitchen table during Christmas dinner, holding her fork very still and focusing on a leaf in the tablecloth pattern. The months accumulated. The amounts varied but averaged somewhere between $200 and $400. 11 months. I know because I kept the records. Not out of resentment, not initially, but because I am someone who works in financial operations, and keeping records is simply what I do. The way some people make their beds every morning or always lock the door twice. I kept records of everything, which is what made what happened in October possible. October came, and with it my mother's monthly call, which arrived on the 14th instead of the usual Tuesday morning slot, which itself should have been a small signal. She said they needed $800 by Friday. This was twice the usual amount. I asked, carefully, the way I always ask things that might disturb the surface, what the money was for. My mother explained that they were a little behind on the mortgage and there was a fee involved if they missed the deadline. $800 by Friday. I said I'd see what I could do, which is what I always said, and which had never once resulted in anything other than my sending exactly what was asked. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. A long time, meaning maybe 20 minutes, which for me is a long time to sit without doing something productive. I was looking at my laptop screen, at the spreadsheet I'd been working on before the call, the one with 11 months of records in it, the amounts in one column and the dates in another, and a third column I'd recently added where I described, in brief functional terms, what each payment had ostensibly been for. $800 by Friday. I thought about the conversation on the way home from Mrs. Hargrove's office. I thought about the seed money for Kyle's restaurant. I thought about my father's voice when he said they'd always been a little stretched thin. And then I did something I had never done before in my 7 years of limited contact with my parents. I started asking questions. Not on the phone. On my own. With the computer and the records and the particular kind of focused attention that I bring to my job every day and had never, until that Tuesday afternoon in October, thought to bring to this. I started with what I knew, which was the mortgage. My parents had lived on Crescent Mill Road for 26 years. My father had worked as an electrician for most of that time, retiring 4 years ago at 63, earlier than planned, due to the back problems he referenced occasionally in conversation. My mother had been a part-time bookkeeper for a local auto dealership until the dealership closed, at which point she had not found other work, which my father had never particularly seemed to mind. I knew the house was worth something. The neighborhood had changed in recent years. The houses around them had been bought and renovated by people who weren't from there, and property values had gone up considerably. What I did not know was what else I might find if I looked. What I found was quite a lot. It started innocently enough. I was curious about the property records, which are public in our state and available online through the county assessor's office. I found the house, found my parents' names, found the assessed value, $340,000, nearly double what they would have paid for it. And then, almost as an afterthought, I noticed a lien filed 18 months ago. A second mortgage, for $122,000. I stared at that number for a while. Then I wrote it down. Then I started looking at the company that held the second mortgage, and that search led me somewhere I hadn't expected to go at all, which was into a web of documents that were not hidden, exactly, but that had simply never occurred to me to look for because no one had ever suggested I look. My hands were very still on the keyboard. This is what I remember most clearly from that moment. Not shock in any dramatic physical sense, not the racing heart or the tears, but the absolute stillness of my hands, the way they sat on the desk completely motionless while my mind moved very fast in a very specific direction. The lien had been filed 18 months ago. The borrower listed was not my father. It was a business entity. Harland Kitchen LLC. I knew that name. Harland was my father's middle name. It was also Kyle's middle name. A family tradition, passed from father to son. Kyle's restaurant, I knew, had been called something else, a name he'd picked himself, something about the street it was on. But Harland Kitchen LLC was a different entity, incorporated 2 years ago, which predated the restaurant's closure. It was still active. I copied the registration number into a different search and waited while the state business registry loaded, and when it came up, it listed 2 members, Kyle David Harland Dempsey, my brother, and one other person. The other person was me, Sara Marie Dempsey, my name. Listed as a member of a business entity I had never heard of, never signed anything for, never been told existed. My phone was face down on the desk beside the laptop. I was aware of it the way you are aware of something without looking at it directly. I turned it over. I didn't call anyone yet. I sat in the silence of my apartment, which was the kind of silence I had spent 7 years building around myself. Earned silence. The silence of a space that was entirely my own. And I let myself understand what I was looking at. Then I opened a new tab and searched for my name and my credit report and made a list of every financial instrument I could find attached to my Social Security number. I am an organized person. I was thorough. What I found took me the better part of that night to fully absorb. There was a business credit line in the name of Harland Kitchen LLC, co-signed by Sara Marie Dempsey, for $40,000, opened 23 months ago. There was beneath it a draw of $37,800. There was also a filing from 14 months ago, a document that modified the LLC's operating agreement, which had been signed, apparently, by Sara Marie Dempsey, authorizing Kyle David Harland Dempsey as the sole managing member. I had signed none of these things. I had never signed any of these things. I had never been in the same room as any of these documents. But there was my name. And there was something that was, when I looked at it in high resolution through the business registry document viewer, my signature. I sat back from the desk. The kettle I'd filled earlier had gone cold. Outside, the city made its nighttime sounds, a bus passing 3 blocks over, someone's music from the apartment above, the general low hum of a place that does not stop existing when you stop paying attention to it. I pressed my fingers flat against the desk surface and breathed in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts, which is something I'd learned to do in a particularly difficult stretch 3 years ago when work was hard and I was sleeping badly. And I did it until the roaring in my ears settled into something quieter. Then I picked up my phone and called Danny. "I need you to tell me I'm not misreading something," I said when she picked up. "Okay," Danny said, because Danny has always been the kind of person who says okay first and asks questions second. I explained what I'd found. I read her the relevant parts. I sent her screenshots. There was a long pause on her end. I could hear her turning the information over. "Sara," she said finally, "that's fraud." "I know," I said. That's your signature that isn't your signature." "I know. How long has this been open?" 23 months. Another pause. "And they've been calling you every month asking for money for how long?" 11 months. While the credit line exists, yes." Danny was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her thinking in the way I have heard her think for 15 years, since we were in the same homeroom in 8th grade, and she always chewed her pen cap when she was working something out. "Sara," she said, "what are you gonna do?" "I don't know yet," I told her honestly. "But I'm not sending the $800. I didn't sleep that night. I made coffee at 2 in the morning, and I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, and I wrote down everything I knew in one column and everything I didn't know in another. And I looked at both columns for a long time, and then I started making a third column, which was what I needed to find out and how. By 4 in the morning, the third column was the longest. At 5:15, when the sky outside was doing that particular gray to rose transition that I have always found easier to look at than sunrise proper, I got up and stood at the window and thought about my grandmother, specifically about my grandmother's house, which was a different house from the one on Crescent Mill Road, a house 30 miles south of there, a smaller house where she had lived alone after my grandfather died, and where I had spent long summer afternoons when I was young, sitting on her screened porch eating watermelon before the dynamic of my family had clarified itself enough for me to understand what it was. My grandmother had died 6 years ago. I had driven to the funeral. I had sat in the second pew. I had stood at the grave in the November cold. I knew she had a will. I knew she had left some things to specific people. What I had not known until I went looking at 4 in the morning with my legal pad was the exact contents of that will. My grandmother's house had sold after her death for $212,000. The sale had been handled by my uncle, her son, who was the executor of her estate. According to the will, the proceeds were to be divided among her 4 grandchildren, Kyle, myself, and our 2 cousins from my uncle's family. Equal shares, $53,000 apiece. I found the probate records through the county clerk's online portal, which in our state maintains records going back several decades and has been, in the last few years, mostly digitized. The probate had closed 4 years ago. The assets had been distributed. I found the disbursement records. Kyle's share had been paid to him directly. My cousin's shares had been paid to them. Mine had been. And this is the part where the stillness returned to my hands. That particular quality of motionlessness that is not calm but its opposite. Something that has gathered itself so completely it no longer requires movement. Mine had been deposited into a joint account held by Sara Marie Dempsey and Patricia Ann Dempsey. Patricia Ann Dempsey was my mother. I had never had a joint account with my mother. I had never been asked to open a joint account with my mother. I had been kicked out of my parents' house at 18 with $47, and I had spent 7 years building everything I had from scratch. And there was, according to the probate records of my grandmother's estate, $53,000 that had been placed into an account bearing my name without my knowledge, and then, presumably, used. I closed the laptop. I opened it again. I found the original account number listed in the disbursement record, and I looked at it for a long time as though looking hard enough at a sequence of digits would tell me something. I was 32 years old and I had not slept, and outside the sky was fully pink now, the city waking up, the sounds of it beginning their morning register. I thought about my mother's monthly calls, the warmth in her voice, her back, her prescription copay, the power bill, the water bill, the mortgage. I thought about how the calls had started 8 months after my grandmother's estate closed. I thought about the sequence of this very carefully, sitting at my kitchen table in the pink morning light, and I thought, I have been paying them back their own theft for 11 months. And then I stopped thinking and started planning. The plan took 10 days to make properly. I am not a person who acts before I understand the full shape of a situation, and the full shape of this situation was large and had corners I needed to see around before I could determine where to stand. I called an attorney on the 3rd day, a woman named Patricia Holloway who specialized in financial fraud and estate law and had, according to the 3 different online reviews I read before calling her, a particular reputation for being methodical and not easily impressed by sentiment. Her office was in a gray stone building downtown, 2nd floor, with a waiting room that smelled like coffee and old paper, and had 2 framed botanical prints on the wall that looked like the kind of prints you buy specifically to make a room feel like it has no personality worth discussing. I sat in one of the padded chairs and filled out her intake form on a clipboard and handed it to the receptionist, who thanked me. And then I sat for 11 minutes looking at the botanical prints until Patricia Holloway came out herself to bring me in. She was in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the kind of face that had clearly been trained over many years to receive difficult information without flinching. I handed her the legal pad with my 3 columns and a folder with printouts of everything I'd found. She read through it in silence. I watched her face. She read and turned pages, and I watched her face, and there was only one moment. One single moment, about 4 minutes in when she was looking at the LLC registration, where something shifted slightly around her eyes. She looked up. "How long ago did you find this?" 10 days, I said. She nodded once. "Have you contacted your family?" "No." "Good," she said, and picked up her pen. "Let's talk about what we do next." What we did next involved, first, a formal request through her office to the credit bureau to flag the Sara Dempsey co-signature on the Harlan Kitchen LLC credit line as potentially fraudulent. This was not the same as filing a dispute. It was a preliminary step, a marking, something that put a pin in the record while we gathered more. Second, she requested the original account records from the bank that had received my grandmother's estate disbursement, which was a process that required my signature on several forms and the official letterhead of her office. Third, she sent a records request to the State Business Registry for the full corporate filing history of Harlan Kitchen LLC, including any amendments to the operating agreement and all signatures attached thereto. All of this took 8 days. On the 9th day, I got a call from the credit bureau informing me that they had flagged the Harlan Kitchen account and were launching a formal inquiry, and that in the meantime they had placed a fraud alert on my credit file. I thanked the woman on the phone in a calm and even voice. After I hung up, I went to my bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists for a minute, the way I do when I need to stay present in my body. And then I dried my hands and went back to my desk. On the 10th day, Patricia Holloway called me and said the bank records had come in. "The joint account was opened," she said, reading from something. "23 months ago, 4 months after your grandmother's estate disbursement. The initial deposit was $53,412. That's exactly the amount. Yes, the account has had 11 subsequent withdrawals, totaling $51,800. Current balance, $1,612. I wrote this down. I kept my voice very steady. "What else?" "The LLC signature on the operating agreement amendment," she said, "is the same signature that appears on the account opening documents for the joint account. Our forensic document specialist has reviewed both." The same person signed both. The same person signed both, and it wasn't you. There was a pause. "Sara," she said, "this is a significant case. The damages are substantial and the evidence is clean. I want to be very clear with you about what that means for what comes next." I took a breath. "Tell me," I said. "I want to tell you about the night before I called my mother. It was a Thursday in early November, and the city outside my apartment window had that particular late autumn quality where the air is cold enough to make the lights look sharp, each street lamp a distinct point rather than a blur. I had a cup of tea on the table in front of me, the kind I make when I'm not sleeping, chamomile with honey, something warm that doesn't have anything else in it that might keep me awake. And I was sitting with both hands around the mug, not drinking it, just holding the warmth. I was thinking about the house on Crescent Mill Road, about the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling of my bedroom that were probably still there, or more likely painted over by now, about the hydrangea bushes that were probably still untrimmed, about the particular angle of the kitchen table where I had sat for so many years saying nothing in a voice that I had learned to modulate into complete inaudibility. I was thinking about the woman I had been at 18, standing at the bus stop with 2 bags and a bin and a bicycle I had to come back for the next day, and I was thinking about the woman I was now. What separates these 2 women, I thought, is not only time and money and a career and an apartment. What separates them is that the second woman knows the price of everything she was told she'd never have, and everything that was taken from her anyway. I put my tea down. I looked at my phone on the table. I thought, tomorrow I will call my mother, and when she answers with that warmth, I will not send the $800. I will not send anything. I will begin to unwind what has been done, and I will do it with the same thoroughness and patience I bring to everything. I am my grandmother's granddaughter. She left me something, and I am going to get it back. I finished the tea. I went to bed. I slept 4 hours, which was, for the first time in 11 days, A full 4 hours. Uninterrupted. Deep. I called my mother on a Friday morning at 9 o'clock when I knew she would be home and my father would be in the garage with the television on and not paying attention. My mother answered on the second ring. "Sara, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear coffee being poured, the ordinary domestic sound of a morning. "I was just thinking about you. Did you get my message about—" "Mom," I said, "I can't send money this month." A beat. The coffee sound stopped. "Okay," she said carefully, in the particular tone that is the careful version. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is fine," I said. "I've just been doing some financial planning and I need to make some adjustments." A longer pause. I could hear her breathing. "Of course," she said. "No, we completely understand. These things happen." Her voice had not changed its warmth, but something beneath it had, a slight structural shift, like a building settling. "I did want to ask you about something, though," I said. And this is where my voice changed. Not dramatically, not with tears or accusation, but with the particular flat evenness that I have found, in professional settings, to be more effective than anything else when you want someone to understand that you are not confused about what they have done. I've been doing some research into my financial records, including some records related to Grandma Ellen's estate. The silence this time was different. It had a different quality, a solidity to it, an occupied silence rather than a pause. "There's a joint account," I said, "at First Centralized Bank, opened in my name and your name 23 months ago. I'd like you to tell me about it." "Sara." "And there's an LLC," I said, continuing in the same even voice, "called Harlan Kitchen, that lists me as a member and has my signature on its operating agreement and on a $40,000 credit line. I'd like you to tell me about that too." What followed was 22 seconds of silence, which I counted because I needed something to do with the part of my brain that was not being used for speaking, and because counting is the thing I do when I need to be very sure of myself. 22 seconds. And then my mother said, "I think your father should be part of this conversation." "He can be," I said. "But first you should know that I have an attorney and she has already contacted the credit bureau and requested the bank records and the LLC documentation. So this isn't a conversation about whether these things happened. It's a conversation about what happens next." Another silence. Shorter, 5 or 6 seconds. And then something happened that I had genuinely not prepared for, because I had prepared for a great many things, but not for this. My mother started crying. Real crying. Not performed. I know her crying by this point. All its variations. This was the kind of crying that comes from the body rather than from strategy, sudden and uncontrolled. "Sara," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "We were going to tell you. We were going to fix it." "Mom," I said, and my voice was still even. "When Kyle's restaurant needed seed money, I was told you were stretched thin. I was 17. I wanted to go to college." "I know. When I was 18 and you asked me to leave, you had this account." "Sara, I want to understand," I said, "how what happened to me fits with the fact that there was money." The crying intensified and then, after a moment, stopped as abruptly as it had started. "Your father and I need to discuss this with you in person," my mother said in a different voice now, the one that had the structure back in it. "I understand," I said, "but I want you to know that any discussion in person will take place with my attorney's knowledge and with a recording, and that the formal fraud inquiry with the credit bureau is already underway and cannot be withdrawn by either of us. I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling to tell you where things stand." I waited. "Okay," my mother said, very quietly. "Okay, Sara. I'll be in touch about the meeting," I said. And then I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen and let my hands shake. Finally, because they had been wanting to shake for 11 days and I had not let them. I want to tell you about the particular quality of the 2 weeks that followed, because they are important for understanding what happened after. My mother called back 3 times in the first 48 hours. The calls went from the crying of our first conversation through a phase of careful, reasonable-sounding explanations. We were going to put the money back. We were protecting the estate from creditors Kyle had at the time. We never meant for it to go this long. You know how these things accumulate. And into a phase that I recognized from my childhood as the phase that comes when the other approaches have not worked. This was the phase of the long explanation about everything my parents had ever done for me, which is to say the years of housing and feeding me, which is to say the minimum and expected functions of being a parent recoded as extraordinary sacrifice. My mother delivered this particular version of our family history in a 40-minute phone call that I recorded with Patricia Holloway's knowledge. And during those 40 minutes, she mentioned, in passing, 4 times, that she had always known I would find a way to land on my feet, which was offered as a compliment, but which I heard for what it was. The retroactive justification of every decision made about me, dressed in the language of faith. I listened. I said very little. I wrote things down. On the 3rd day, Kyle called. This was different. Kyle calling was something that had not happened in years. I looked at my screen and I thought about picking up and I decided not to. He left a voicemail. Sara, the voicemail began, and his voice had in it something I recognized from childhood as the tone he used when he needed something from a person who was currently refusing to provide it. I know things look bad right now, but I want you to understand that I genuinely did not know about everything that happened with your name on those documents. I thought Mom had talked to you. I swear I thought... I stopped the voicemail. I played it again and listened all the way through, and then I saved it and sent it to Patricia. She said, "Useful. Let me know if he calls again." He called again the next day. This time I picked up. I stood at my kitchen window looking at the street, and I said hello, with the evenness I had been practicing, and Kyle said, "Sara, I know you're angry." And I said, "I'm not angry, Kyle. I'm looking at documents." Sara, "When did you know?" I didn't know. "When did you know that my name was on the LLC?" A pause. The kind of pause that is not uncertainty, but rather the process of calculating what version of events to present. "It was Mom's idea," he said. "I was told you had agreed, that you were okay with being a silent member because it would help me get the credit line. I didn't know you didn't know." "And the joint account with the estate money?" Another pause. "I didn't know about that," he said. "Kyle," I said, and my voice was perfectly even. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to understand that the answer won't change what's already underway with the credit bureau and the attorney. But I'm asking because you are my brother, and I want to understand. Did you spend any of the estate money?" The silence lasted 9 seconds. I counted. "Some of it went toward the restaurant," he said finally. "When things got bad, Mom said she'd talk to you. She said she'd explain and you'd be fine with it." I closed my eyes briefly. The restaurant, the seed investment, the second mortgage, the monthly calls. The picture assembled itself fully in my mind, all its parts in all their correct positions, and I looked at it with the particular feeling of someone who has known for a long time that something was wrong without knowing exactly what it was, and who now finally knows exactly what it was. "Okay," I said. "I need you to know, Kyle, that the credit line in my name, the $40,000 line that you drew $37,800 from, has gone to the credit bureau as a fraudulent account. Your business entity is the named party. You should speak to an attorney." "Sara," he said, and now his voice had changed entirely, the careful calculation stripped out of it, replaced with something raw. "Please, Mom and Dad, they're not going to... You should speak to an attorney," I said again. And I ended the call. The formal meeting happened on a Saturday in mid-November. My parents' kitchen on Crescent Mill Road, 11 in the morning. I drove myself. I wore the same clothes I would wear to a business meeting. Dark navy slacks, a white blouse, my grandmother's small gold earrings, which I had found among the belongings I'd brought with me from my childhood home when I left, and which had sat in my jewelry box for 14 years, and which I put on that morning with particular intentionality. Patricia Holloway was not present in the room but was available by phone if needed, and had been given copies of every document I was bringing. I brought a folder, Inside the folder were printed copies of the joint account records, the LLC registration, the credit line documentation, the estate disbursement record, and a one-page summary that Patricia had prepared which laid out, in plain language, the legal exposure involved. I arrived at 10:58. The hydrangea bushes were still untrimmed. The driveway had been swept, which was not its usual state. My mother had, I noticed, made coffee and set out the good cups. My father was sitting at the kitchen table. The same dark green vine tablecloth, though the cloth looked washed and perhaps newer than I remembered. And he looked smaller than I expected. Not physically diminished, not frail, just smaller. The way rooms look smaller when you go back to them after years away because you were a child when you were there and now you are something else. He stood when I came in. "Sara," he said. "Dad?" I said. My mother came in from the hallway behind him and stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, looking at me with an expression I didn't know how to read. I sat down. I opened the folder. I did not say anything about the weather or the drive or how they looked or anything else. I said, "I'd like to start from the beginning." What followed was 3 hours, not a shouting match, not a scene. I have spent a long time trying to describe it accurately, and the most accurate description I can offer is that it was a reckoning, by which I mean a process of accounting, of going through the numbers one by one and assigning each its correct meaning. My father, to his credit, did not attempt the versions my mother had attempted on the phone. He sat across from me with the folder open between us, and he explained. He explained about Kyle's restaurant and the first investment and the second and the third, and how the business had been struggling and how the second mortgage had seemed manageable at the time, and how the estate money had come in at a moment when everything was very tight and my mother had said it would only be temporary. They'd pay it back before I ever needed to know, and how the LLC had been Kyle's idea for the credit line, and my mother had suggested using my name because I had good credit, good solid credit, and Kyle's was already overextended, and she had thought, he said this very quietly, she had thought I would understand. She thought I would understand, I said. "Sara, did anyone consider that I was building my credit specifically because I was building it from nothing? Because at 18 I had nothing?" My father looked at the tablecloth. "She thought it wouldn't affect you," he said, "as long as the payments were made." "Were the payments made?" A pause, for a while. He said. I looked at my mother. She was sitting very still in her chair, her hands folded in front of her on the table. She had been crying earlier, before I arrived, I think, from the traces of it. But she was not crying now. "When the estate money was put into a joint account," I said, "was there any plan to tell me it existed?" "We were going to use it to pay off some of the debt," my mother said, "and then give you what was left." "There's $1,600 left," I said. "Mom, there's $1,600 left of $53,000. My mother's face crumpled and reassembled itself in the space of 3 seconds. "I know," she said. "Sweetheart, I know. We made mistakes. We made serious mistakes." "And the monthly calls," I said. I watched both of them. I wanted to see their faces when I said this. "You have been calling me every month asking for money for 11 months, while a credit line in my name exists, while an account with my inheritance exists. What was the money you were asking me for?" My father looked at my mother. My mother looked at her hands. "Some months it was for genuine bills," my mother said. "The power, the prescription, those were real." "And the other months?" My mother was quiet for a long moment. "The mortgage," she said finally. "When we fell behind on the mortgage, there wasn't the second mortgage, the one Kyle needed when the restaurant was..." She stopped, started again. "The $800, she said. "This month's $800. It was for the second mortgage payment, the one on the lien." I sat with this information for a moment. I let it arrange itself. They had taken my inheritance. They had borrowed against their house for my brother's restaurant. They had put a credit line in my name. And every month for 11 months, they had called me to make up the shortfall on the repayment of the debt that had consumed what was mine. I looked at the folder on the table. I thought about what Patricia Holloway had said when I'd first laid all of this out for her. She had said, "The damages are substantial and the evidence is clean." "I have something I need to explain to you about the house," I said. "This is the part I want you to understand clearly, because it is important and it is not complicated, though I want to be accurate. My grandmother's will had left me not only a cash share of her estate, but also, and I had not known this, had not found it until Patricia Holloway's research turned it up, a 10% ownership interest in the Crescent Mill Road house itself. My grandmother had bought the house for my parents in 1998, a gift when they first married, structured as a partial ownership stake for both of them and a small reserve stake, 10%, held in trust for her grandchildren, which was later adjusted through a codicil to name me specifically. I had not been told about this. I was not sure my parents knew about this. That is, they may have known in the abstract that such a provision existed somewhere in the original deed, without ever having given it direct attention, without having examined it against the implications it would have if I had reason to go looking. Patricia Holloway had examined those implications in considerable detail. "The 10% ownership interest," I said to my parents, "means that any refinancing of the property, including the second mortgage, required my signature or the signature of a legal representative acting on my behalf." My father's face changed. Not dramatically. A very particular change, a subtle rearrangement of the lines around his eyes and mouth, the kind of change that happens when a person who has not been thinking about a problem in full suddenly sees its full dimensions. "No one asked me to sign the second mortgage," I said, "which means the second mortgage may not be valid as executed." I let that sit. I watched my father process it. I watched my mother's hands tighten against each other on the table. "What are you going to do?" my father asked. It was the first time in 3 hours that he had asked me a direct question about my intentions rather than about the past. I looked at him. He looked back. He looked at this moment exactly like my father, which is to say he looked like a man who had made a series of decisions he had not thought all the way through, and who was sitting across from his daughter looking at the end of the line of them. "I'm going to talk to my attorney," I said. "About all of it. The estate money, the LLC, the credit line, the ownership interest. All of it." I stood up and picked up my folder. My mother stood too, reflexively. "Sara," she said, "I would like things to be different between us. I want you to know that." I looked at her. The gold earrings were small and cool against my earlobes. My grandmother's earrings. "I know you would," I said, and I walked out of the kitchen through the hallway and out the front door. The hydrangeas were brown and heavy with cold. I got in my car. I sat in the driveway for 1 minute looking at the dashboard, and then I drove away. Over the next 6 weeks, 3 significant things happened. The first was that the Credit Bureau's fraud inquiry concluded with a finding that the Sara Dempsey co-signature on the Harlan Kitchen LLC credit line was not verified as authentic, and the credit line was removed from my credit file and marked as disputed. The credit damage was reversed. The $37,800 drawn against that line remained the legal and financial responsibility of Harlan Kitchen LLC and its managing member. Kyle received a formal legal notice from the creditor through Patricia Holloway's office regarding the disputed signature. He called me once after receiving it. I did not answer. The second significant thing was that the estate account, the joint account at First Centralized Bank, was formally disputed through the bank's fraud division, and the remaining $1,612 was released to me. It was not the $53,000. It was what was left. I deposited it and watched the number sit in my account and felt something that was not satisfaction, but was perhaps adjacent to it. The feeling of a thing being returned to its proper location after a long time in the wrong place. The third thing was the second mortgage. This one was more complex, took longer, involved more paperwork and 2 additional attorneys and a great deal of correspondence with the mortgage company. But the outcome, which arrived in late January, was what Patricia had anticipated. The second mortgage, having been executed without the required signature of a 10% interest holder, was determined to be defectively executed. This did not mean it was simply erased. These things are never simple. But it meant that it needed to be renegotiated, re-executed, made right. The mortgage company was not pleased. My brother was not pleased. My parents, when they were notified of the issue through their own attorney, who they had finally retained, I do not know exactly what they were. I did not speak to them during those 6 weeks. I did not call. They did not call me. The silence had a different quality this time. Not the imposed silence of my childhood, not the silence of being the furniture in a room that doesn't need to be asked about its feelings. This was a silence I had chosen, for the first time in my life entirely on my own terms, and it fit differently. It felt, if I am being accurate, like space. Like actual space, the kind you can move around in. In February, I got a letter, not a call. A letter mailed from Crescent Mill Road, handwritten in my mother's careful schoolteacher's cursive, which she learned in the 60s and has maintained ever since. It was 2 pages. It said a great many things, and I will not reproduce all of them here, because some of them were private in a way I want to preserve. But the parts that matter are these. My mother said she had known, always, that she had done something to me that could not be undone simply by pretending it had gone differently. That the choice to use my name, my credit, my inheritance, had been justified to herself at the time in a language of necessity and temporary measures, and the belief that I would never need to know because she would fix it before I found out, and that she understood now that this was not a justification but a confession in different clothes. She said she did not know whether I wanted to have a relationship with them, and that she would understand if I did not. She said my grandmother had left me the earrings specifically, in a note she had written out by hand in her last year, because she thought I had a quiet strength that deserved to be recognized, and she was sorry I had only known about the earrings and not about the other things my grandmother had wanted me to have. I read the letter twice. I sat with it for several days. I did not know what to do with it, which is not the same as knowing what I would eventually decide to do, only that the deciding was not something I could rush. 6 months later, it is the end of summer now, and I am sitting at my kitchen table with the window open and the kind of light that comes in late afternoon and lands flat on the floor like something someone set down carefully. I can tell you what I decided. I decided for now to leave space between myself and them. Not permanent silence, not the resolution of the question, but space, room to think and room to breathe and room to be, for the first time, the person who chooses the shape of the relationship rather than the person who fits herself into whatever shape was offered. My father had a phone call with me in June, just the one, 15 minutes, during which he said what my mother had written and also some things of his own. And I listened and said what I had to say, which was not much but was honest. Kyle I have not spoken to since the voicemail. Maybe that will change. I don't know. What I know is this. I have my credit back. I have the $1,612 back. I have, through the negotiation of the second mortgage, received a formal settlement of my ownership interest in the Crescent Mill Road property. A buyout, handled through the attorneys that put $28,000 into my account in April. I have, as a result, moved to a different apartment. Better than the last one. 2 bedrooms, and one of the bedrooms is an office with a door that closes and a desk that is mine and no one else's. I have begun putting money toward a proper emergency fund, a retirement contribution increase, and a modest investment account. I have also signed up for a weekly pottery class, which has nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with being someone who gets to do things that are only for her. My phone does not light up every month with the same number asking for the same thing. That ended in November, as you might imagine it would. Occasionally, I think about the calls, the 11 months of them. The warmth in my mother's voice that arrived like weather preceding a storm. I understand now that the warmth was real. People can love you imperfectly, incompletely, in ways that cost you a great deal without their ever quite recognizing the bill they are running up. And that understanding the warmth was real doesn't obligate me to accept the cost. My grandmother's earrings are on my dresser in a small ceramic dish that I made in the second week of pottery class. They are small and gold and unremarkable to anyone who doesn't know what they are. Every morning I look at them and I think about a woman who sat on a screened porch 30 miles south of here eating watermelon in the summer, who saw something in me that she wanted to acknowledge, who left me something she wanted me to have. I leave the earrings in the dish most days. Some mornings I put them on. On those mornings, when I catch them in the mirror on my way out the door, I think, I figured it out, Grandma. I landed on my feet. But this time, I did it for me.